Hello and good morning from New York, and good afternoon from Europe, and good evening from Dubai. My name is Bart van Ark. I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and welcome to our monthly Window On, which this time is on Window on the Global Consumer, our virtual panel, in which we are speaking about hot topics, real-time topics with experts from the Conference Board and from others, the other experts around the world, on a monthly basis. This month, the topic is around the global consumer. We all know, certainly this week, with all the happenings in Davos, that business leaders get increasingly nervous about the future of the economy in 2019. But the critical question is, what do consumers themselves actually expect? Consumers are critical to the economy because they contribute between 60 and 70% of our GDP. And for them, many factors like job availability, income rises, a better understanding of the purchasing power of their hard-earned money, that will really determine their willingness to spend. But at the same time, the consumer themselves is very rapidly changing. Preferences change all the time. But with today's digital economy, they have dramatically changed consumer behavior, and all sorts of options are now available to access your product, to buy it, and to get it exactly when and where you want it at your doorstep very fast. But that's a critical trend for consumer behavior, but there are other trends too. Consumers don't only want to be online, they want better experiences around the products and services they buy, they want better experiences to make their products more sustainable. They want to recycle their products if it can be done easily. They want to be sure that companies are treating their data safely. So some of those trends will only slowly evolve, but some of them will actually very quickly impact on us and may or may not accelerate even in 2019. Then, of course, as I said on the background, there is the economic environment that will impact on how the consumer will ultimately think about where things are going and how much he or she is willing to spend. So in this first window for 2019, we are going to talk with our experts panel on some critical global consumer trends that are important to watch. And the first topic that we'll talk about is our Global Consumer Confidence Index, which has been released just today. For the fourth quarter of 2018, where we have data for 64 countries around the world. We can begin to see what kind of differences do we see between regions, how has it changed over the past couple of quarters, and how do consumers think about critical factors underlying their behavior, including the availability of jobs, their income, and their spending behavior. The second topic we're going to talk about is what are the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities in the consumer sector. I already mentioned the issue of digital, but there are many other trends ongoing, and we benefit here from another survey that we recently released, our annual C-Suite Challenge survey, where there are one or two questions on future consumer also, and we'll discuss those questions with our panel. And then finally, we will talk a little bit about the transformation of the digital economy. It's already mentioned something that is very important. How fast is the trend towards digital retail really evolving? What are the most important trends that we need to watch? And also, what is actually exactly the future of brick and mortar stores, which are still there to a large extent? As I mentioned, we're going to do that with a great panel, which I'm going to introduce to you right now. In our studio in New York, we have Steve Otland. Steve is President and CEO of the Conference Board, but also former CEO of Home Depot and Office Depot, where he's been CEO for many years. Steve, it's great to have you on.
Thank you, Bart,
for joining us. And then next to Steve, we have Denise Daalhoofd. Denise is new to the Conference Board, senior researcher on consumer research coming from Wharton, where she has worked on consumer topics for a very long time, and we're very happy to have you on board, and we hope this is not the first time we will have you, and not the last time we will have you, I should say.
Thanks so much, Bart. Great to be here.
Absolutely. And then finally, calling in from Prague, is Regan Leggett. Regan is an executive director for thought and leadership and foresight at the Nielsen Company. Nielsen is a very important collaborator for us, originated the Global Consumer Confidence Survey that we are now carrying out jointly, and it's great, Regan, to have you on and comment on the Consumer Confidence Index and many other issues related to the consumer.
Very nice to be with you.
Okay, so a great panel ahead of us. Please follow, try to be on this call as good as you can. For those of you who have CPE credits, please make sure that you type your full name and your email address in the space provided. Click OK for pre-pop-ups that occur during the program stay online for the entire webcast, and credit is, of course, only available to you if you are participating live. And with that, we're going to go right away into our first topic. And before we do that, we are going to ask a question to you as participants. And that question is, and that's coming up now, with regards to their confidence on jobs and personal finance and spending intentions. What do you expect the consumer to become in 2019? More optimistic relative to 2018? More pessimistic relative to 2018? Not much change compared to last year? Or a mixed picture across jobs, personal finance, and spending intentions? So please take your time. Will the consumer in 2019 be more optimistic relative to 2018, more pessimistic, not much change, or do you think it's be a bit of a mixed picture when it comes to jobs, personal finance, and spending intentions? It's all a critical part of that. We'll leave the line open a little more to see your responses coming in. 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then stop and close the survey. 10% believe that consumers will become more optimistic, but the big majority of you thinks the consumer will become more pessimistic. Although close to 1/3 of you believe that maybe it's a bit of a mixed picture between sentiment around jobs, around personal finance, and spending intentions. Very quickly, and Denise, let's start with you. 30 seconds, what's your first response to this?
I think this is as expected. I think we have heard a lot about the global economic slowdown, although it's not going to be a sharp one, but a sustained one probably over the next year. So this is not surprising to me. We might see a little bit of a big mixed picture across these 3 different categories that affect consumers, so those 30%. But overall, I think it's in line with what might be expected. A little surprised, maybe the more optimistic view by 10%. So anyway.
Well, luckily they're still optimists. Steve,
well,
how
I
about
think
you?
we've been sitting at all-time highs or 20-year highs over the past year, and as we know, consumer confidence is driven to a large extent about how they feel about jobs, and in particular their own jobs. And I think at this point, people probably are looking at it and saying, "This is as good as it gets. How could it not be?" Looking at next year, somewhat more pessimistic. So I think it's pretty natural given where we are with very, very high levels. But the jobs thing is the one that we have to watch, because as the labor market tightens, I think you're going to see a lot of people bouncing around, and that could actually come back to the optimism side. If people are getting higher salaries, bigger and better jobs, they could actually become more optimistic. It's kind of a strange way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but the higher levels are very important to keep in mind. We've been seeing consumers, unusually optimistic pretty much around the world, certainly also in the United States. So some adjustment is to be expected. Regan, your view on those responses. Makes it sense?
Yeah, I think speaking to some of our client leaders, the overarching theme is that driven by regional dynamics, we are going to see some quite big differences by region. So I would agree with that mixed picture across jobs, personal finance, and spending intentions.
Thank you very much. So let's talk a little bit about the results that are coming up right now that the poll is closed. So we can look at the results for the fourth quarter of 2018. The way to read this world map is that the countries that come up as red, and the more redder they are, the higher levels of optimism they have. The point that Steve just referred to, the more bluer they are, the lower the levels are relative to the world average. So globally, the level of consumer confidence is around 107, and you can see that some of the most confident consumers are based in Asia, particularly in India right now, where the level is as high as 133, but also in China and almost all of Southeast Asia, the numbers are well above 110. And in some cases even significantly more than that. If we move more westwards, we see more optimism in the Gulf countries, where I'm right now myself, but also in some parts of Europe, like Germany and Denmark, for example. And then going to the west side of the hemisphere, we see that the United States comes in at 119, Canada just above 100, but still a little bit more positive than the average. So that's the high level that Steve was referring to a little earlier. when we move to the changes of the fourth quarter over the third quarter, we're actually beginning to see a more interesting picture. Here, the countries that are red are the ones that are actually beginning to see more of a decline than the average, whereas the countries that are green are the ones that are actually seeing somewhat less of a decline going forward, of actually an increase in going forward. So where do we see the biggest declines? Of course, in some really troubled economies like Argentina and Turkey, but also, interestingly, in the fourth quarter in France, where we had a lot of protests going on at that time, and people very unhappy about the way the things were going. Russia also slightly negative. Canada now beginning to move slightly into negative territory. And the countries that are really seeing an increase in optimism are quite limited. Some increase in optimism in Mexico and Brazil, a little bit in Saudi Arabia, Australia, which pops up very big here. India still somewhat further on the increase, but if you compare that with the third quarter, there is indeed a somewhat slower pace of improvement in consumer confidence. So with that as a background, Steve, let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that you are seeing when you look at these overall conditions around the world. What are your views on what this means for retail spending that is taking place around the world, but particularly?
Yeah, I think if you you made some of the comments on it, but as you go country by country, you see a great correlation between consumers' attitudes and what's happening locally from a geopolitical standpoint. And so you see the countries that are having difficulty or political turmoil, and witness the yellow vest syndrome in France and in South Korea. You didn't call out; those are interestingly low numbers. But these are the situations that make sense just intuitively when you look at it. I think from a retail standpoint, you pointed out earlier that at least in this country, it's close to 70% of the GDP that is consumer, and that's the case in most market-driven countries around the world. The consumer tends to be very strong all over the world, particularly in luxury goods, if you start looking at that. And we'll come back and talk more about that. But it's interesting, the high end is even higher, but the low end of the demographic scale has held up as well. The U.S. consumer is particularly strong. We've come off a holiday season where we've seen growth in the 5 to 6% range. It's been a phenomenal season at all levels. Part of what we always worry about is in January, whether the returns will come back and the adjustments will be there and the margins will get killed and all of those kinds of things. And you see some unlevel playing field here, even in the U.S. But the consumer is strong and is intending to be strong, and that comes back to my comment on jobs. And so it should remain strong as long as jobs hold up.
But you wonder really, when we look at business confidence, which is the counterpart of consumer confidence, business confidence strongly declined recently. So you wonder, what do business leaders see that consumers do not see? And one more specific question I have is there's this huge ramp up in debt that we're seeing around the world, including some consumer debt that is beginning to go up. Aren't consumers seeing something that business leaders do see, or do you think that the consumers are living in a different
I think the consumers are actually right. I think they're closer to it. The thing that drives business expectations is whether there's certainty to policy or not certainty to policy. And what we see right now is, given the trade situation, given some of the Brexit situations, given some of the geopolitical specific situations I talked about, businesses are less certain than they were last year. And I know people make a lot of this, well, certainty is overplayed. Yeah, but as a former CEO who ran companies, you can't plan 10-year, 15-year, 20-year investments unless you have some visibility to certainty. So it is very important, whereas the consumer lives more in the moment.
Yeah, good, very good point. And how about the debt? The consumer debt is increasing, student debt is increasing, so, are consumers living beyond their means?
Yeah. Well, you see this especially in the United States, where it's seemingly nobody cares about the debt. I think in other countries where they are, that are closer to some very serious situations, like the Chinese consumer, they're much more sensitive to debt than the U.S. consumer. One of the things I'm very worried about on the U.S. consumer debt situation is the impact on mortgages. You've got the millennial generation coming out of school with the highest level of student debt ever. It is delaying the purchase of homes, and that is putting a big damper on economic growth. You would normally see housing contributing about, I think, another 50 to 100 basis points to the GDP at this point, which is not happening because of the debt situation.
Interesting, very interesting. Denise, before I go to you, one important point that I did forget, and that is that you as an audience, we'd like you to ask us questions. And you can do that. We're set up for that. There's a box on your screen. You can put your questions in there anytime during the webcast. Because, of course, we'd like to hear from you about questions that you may have to the panel or observations that you would like to make. So please do that, and we will weave it in anywhere during our conversation. So Denise, let's go and talk a little bit more about Europe, perhaps, although you may have some comments on other parts of the world too. Quite a varied picture in Europe. Of course, it's a diverse region with lots of different things happening. We saw this big decline in France, but other parts of Europe are still fairly positive. We have this whole Brexit thing hanging above our head, but so far the UK consumer is still hanging in well there. What do you think are the most important factors that are determining the confidence of European consumers?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in Europe, and I'm actually not surprised to see the picture. First of all, it sticks out that Europe is in blue, meaning it's like in the colder region of the temperature. So there has been so much going on in individual countries, like we already mentioned Brexit, of course France, the protests. Germany is still struggling with, getting a grip on immigration, what are the future plans. Spain has been debating independence of Catalonia, and Italy, has been unstable. So each of the individual countries has their own issues going on. And as we know, Europe is very connected. They depend on their neighbors for exports and also beyond, Europe. But with all this connection and with their own troubles, it's not surprising that there is, that consumer confidence is down. So going forward, I think the very important aspects is, of course, Brexit, stability in France. Also, the European Central Bank has been talking about raising interest rates this summer. So we'll see what happens to that, but that could be a really important aspect. Of course, the global trade conversations will affect the EU as well. And then also externally for the EU itself, the conversations with the US about trade will be key. And generally in Europe, you also see what's troubling is that the large economies that are usually the engines, like Germany, UK, France, Spain, as well as Italy, that also have very big export numbers, that they have been going down in confidence. On the other hand, smaller economies like Austria, Croatia, and Serbia have gained, as well as, which is good to see, like weaker economies like Turkey, Greece, and Italy have gained a little bit in confidence, but from a lower level. So, the total, in the aggregate, it just leaves Europe in a weaker position.
Do you think there's any difference between the way that Europeans are responding to these things that are happening around them than Americans? I mean, you and I both lived for quite a while in the United States, but we're Europeans, and I sometimes feel that U.S. consumers are more quickly responding to changes in their environment. You lose your job faster, you see bigger impacts on your income, whereas in the case of Europe, all these things take a little bit more time. Is that something you see, or do you think that's a little bit overdone?
It is true. On the other hand, you also have to think about the very different structures of the markets. EU, of course, it's an economic union. However, you still have the individual countries, and there is a lot of trade going on across countries. So each country also has to look for their foreign markets for growth. In the US and also in China, you have a very different situation because you have a very vast domestic market. So, in balance, I think, Europeans and Americans might respond differently, therefore, to external, events that are going on.
Steve, before I go to Regan, what's your response to that? You've operated in your businesses before with consumers in both parts of the world. Do you think they behave different and they react differently to their economic environment in Europe than they do in the United States?
Yeah, because Europe is in recent memory suffered bigger cycles. They've suffered more stagnation. They've suffered, of course, the turmoil of wars. Whereas the United States, just has not seen that. Yeah, we had the financial crisis, but there were bailouts and so forth, and so the pain has been different. And I think the closer you are to the last crisis and the depth of that crisis sort of defines the sensitivity of the consumer. And I just don't think that the U.S. consumer has seen what consumers around the rest of the world have seen. And finally, the debt situation. I mean, the debt is so cheap and so plentiful. They're sending credit cards to your house daily, begging you to sign up and go into more debt. I mean, it gives you a little bit of confidence, but I think some of that's false confidence.
Yeah. Regan, let's go and talk to you. You've been very patiently and quiet for now, but pick up on whatever you heard, but also extend the story a little bit beyond the U.S. and Europe. Chinese consumers, Steve briefly mentioned it as a major concern. What's happening in other parts of the world when you look at those results?
Yeah, well, I think those heat map maps were an excellent representation of what is happening and just how dynamic market by market consumer confidence is. If you look at Asia in particular for the last quarter, there is a lot of up and down in those markets, but if you trend the region over, say, the last 12 months or even the last 24 months, you see this abundantly optimistic and positive sentiment that aligns with some really sound economic data in terms of wage growth and employment, and it makes sense why this region contains many of the most positive and confident consumers. And we, are certainly seeing the growth within FMCG, and especially in some of those premium categories within FMCG, as aligning very nicely with just how confident consumers are in the Asia region. If you cast the net a little bit wider and start talking about some of the markets that are usually mentioned when we talk about emerging markets, and outside of China and India, and I'm talking about maybe Mexico and Brazil, over the last quarter, again, we've seen some significant jumps. If I focus on Brazil in particular, there are many commentators who would link the rising confidence with what they're seeing in the political sector, the change in political leadership and the new political agenda. So there are a number of elements and factors that we need to look at when we do look at that volatility within some of these markets. Some of these markets have been volatile in terms of political and social level, and I think we will continue to see some of these fluctuations in some of these emerging markets that really aren't associated just with economic data or the things like jobs.
So let's talk a little bit about China more specifically, because everybody's watching China now. Talk this week about slowdown in China. There has been a fair amount of weakness in confidence in China, and even in the numbers that we're looking at right now, there's a little bit of weakness visible in the numbers. What's your opinion about how the consumer in China is faring?
Yeah, it's true, the numbers, there are some weakness. I think what we are seeing in our numbers, especially in FMCG, is that they're switching the way that they're spending. They've been a little bit more reserved. Some of the premium pricing and sales in those premium segments have started to slow a little bit and do correspond quite nicely to the figures that we're seeing weakening. So I think they're hesitant rather than they're losing confidence. They're waiting. There's a let's wait and see approach rather than a loss of confidence.
Art, can I comment on China for a minute?
Right.
I think the conference board and your team has done an excellent job of really stepping out and forecasting where the China GDP is, and we at the conference board believe it's sub 4%, whereas the official numbers have are still north of 6%. There's a view among economists, as you know, that 4% is the threshold at which the pain really starts in China. And we have to remember that there are 900 million people that are not in the coastal urban areas, but are in the rural areas. And they especially feel the pain. And that they're at least a generation closer to, memories of starvation, lack of food, when things start to slow down, and if in fact it is sub 4%, you are really triggering a lot of memories, and all of a sudden everything stops. Savings go way up. You get this reversion from luxury goods back to basic goods, and you see that in China when you operate there. Through these kinds of political fluctuations. But I think we've got now not only political but economic reality going on, and it could be exacerbated by the trade situation. It's hard to know the causality and the true impact of that. But I think that that the Chinese consumer reads that and moves very quickly. They also don't have the source of capital that the U.S. consumer has.
I think that's absolutely true. On the other hand, you could also argue that the Chinese government does have a bit more opportunity to stimulate, and likely in the light of the slowdown this year, they're likely to go to do that again. The question really is how much the consumer is going to benefit from that.
Yeah, and where it happens, because they stimulate mostly in the urban areas, which again doesn't impact the majority of the population, and they are critically worried about unrest, social unrest there, as we all know. And so I think they're sitting at or slightly below the threshold of worry there right now.
Regan, any other countries you want to comment on that you found particularly striking? I was struck, for example, by the rapid uptick in confidence in Brazil. Of course, there's a new political regime there, and the country's coming from a very low level, but still the 17% increase that we saw is quite substantial. Are there any other countries you'd like to observe?
I just think there's an enormous amount of steadiness starting to emerge in Southeast Asia, or that continues to emerge, and I'm really impressed just at how a lot of the spending is aligned with the consumer confidence. Over the last 3 to 4 years in markets like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, China, and India, there has been loose, sometimes inconsistent relationships between positive sentiment and growth that we have seen in both FMCG and outside of FMCG, but that is really compelling. And with the confidence to take on more household debt, we are also seeing, as I mentioned, the growth in premium sales of luxury items and also lifestyle things like travel. So Southeast Asia for me seems to be a real cornerstone of economic growth and consumer spending.
Yeah, we have time for 2 questions that came in from the audience. First question, Steve, probably to you. What do you foresee as the impact in North America and Europe on changing consumer confidence levels on the purchase of big-ticket recreational consumer products such as boats, RVs, high-end bikes, etc.?
Yeah.
More time for vacations so that people can buy this stuff?
Typically you don't see, the changes that we've seen in North America and particularly in the U.S. Do not suggest a slowdown in the high end. Typically what you would see at this point in the cycle is a moderation there, but nothing that we see suggests that. I think what you will see is the middle class and the lower end seeking more value as things do slow down. But remember, they're slowing down off a very, very high level. So you're sitting at theoretically full employment. Wages are rising again for the first time in a very long time. So there is more money out there, even without the debt levels, the credit levels, which are adding to it. So I think that those makers should feel very good about 2019.
Yeah, I just to chime in, I would agree with that. the luxury sector, first of all, confidence is still very high, and also the luxury sector typically doesn't suffer as much, even in an economic downturn. We have seen that in the last recession. I don't want to mention the word recession, but that was one of the takeaways, that the luxury end of the market was actually not suffering as much. However, like for big ticket items, they are typically delayed. If an RV is used as a substitute for travel, of course, that could, that doesn't necessarily have to reduce demand for that. So I think those kinds of goods will still be purchased. Another thought about this is that, the sharing economy, the topic of maybe not buying, but renting or reselling might become actually bigger in these categories as well.
That's a very good point, and that's a big transformation that sector is actually undergoing. Other question is, going back to the issue of debt that we briefly discussed, Steve, the question here is I'm not sure, or the comment, I'm not sure that more consumer debt is good, given the high level of government debt that we're facing as well, plus college debt is long-lasting, and the impacts not just on home sales, but also overall household formation, delays in moving into family mode impact consumption patterns. And any comments on that, on how this whole debt situation is beginning to impact consumer behavior?
Yeah, no, I think those comments are exactly right. We didn't comment on government debt, but as we all know, we are approaching a crisis level. But people have said that for a very long time, and so as a result of that, everybody ignores it. And in our political system, it's a 2-year cycle, and it's not going to bite us this 2 years, so let's ignore it until it does. But the problem is that the enormity of the situation is going to create a crisis that is going to be tough to manage, and it's going to it will be some sort of currency crisis and or economic crisis at that point. So I think that's a very good point. However, back to the fact that we as Americans tend to ignore long-term trends and live for today. It is not affecting us today, but actually household formation is up. It's just not household formation in purchased households. It's increasing in rental situations, which is a different action than we've seen historically.
Regan, any comments from your side on these questions?
I guess going back to the previous question about growth in luxury that Steve alluded to in US. Recently, we looked at this globally, and what we're seeing is that there seems to be growth at both ends, both at the premium end and at the value end, and there's a lot of erosion in the middle. So, I think that might align to what a lot of commentators have been pointing to in terms of that growing prosperity, but the growth of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I think that's going to be a real big consideration for retailers and other organisations moving forward, is how do they look at consumer capability and consumer spending and really segment the way that they approach these different consumers and their different spending ability.
Yeah, that actually is a great transition into our second segment, where we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about long-term consumer trends and which ones of those are beginning to impact on 2019. And for that, we have the luxury of making use of some recent surveying that we've been doing among CEOs and other C-suite, members of the C-suite, which we ask every year a whole bunch of questions about major business trends. We did ask them some questions this year also about the future consumer. What were the important characteristics of the consumer in, say, 2025? And we picked 8 of those important trends that are ongoing that we're showing up in a poll question. And we'd like to ask you, which of the statements you agree with most. So that poll question is supposed to come up now, and you see 8 statements in that poll question. Take your time a little bit, because it's a little bit of a complex question. Which of the statements that you see here for the future consumer you agree with most? And I'll read them out to you. Provide omnichannel approaches for selling products and services. A CEO personally engaging more frequently with key customers and clients. Prototype experiences and business models to enhance speed to market. Emphasize customer client data protection as a competitive advantage. enhance the quality of products and services, develop a more outward-looking customer-centric culture, find customers that are more value-conscious, or emphasize servitization of products. It basically is more services around the products that are being produced. And again, we'll give you a little bit more time because there are a lot of possibilities here, and you may agree with a lot of the statements. Which one do you think are actually the ones that you think are most important when you think about the consumer in 2025 in terms of a trend that is ongoing? So we'll, as I said, give you a little bit of time to begin to understand what we're going to do. After that, I'm going to show you the results that we got from the CEOs, and then discuss in a little bit more detail with Denise, Steve, and Regan what important trends they are observing, and comment on some of the results that you are giving. So let's give it 13 more seconds, and then we're going to discuss the results. You can even change your mind as long as the poll is open. We get a pretty mixed picture in, which is interesting, from various participants. Now we're going to count down from 10. So make your choice now if you haven't done it yet. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then we are closing the poll. More than 1/3, 36.8% of you actually reached consensus on the area of developing a more outward-looking centric culture as being the most important one. We had then a second important one, providing omnichannel approaches to selling products and services. And then we have some spread responses around finding consumers that have more value conscious, some that picked the servitization of products, and one or two that picked prototype experiences and business models to enhance speed to market. So a varied picture. Let's close this call. Let's poll, and let's take a look at what the responses were from CEOs that we were seeing around the world, and that's what you are seeing in this slide. And I'm picking it up myself to see a little bit better what we're looking at. You can enlarge the screen if you like by just clicking on the 4 arrows that you see at the top there. You can read the results a little bit better there. So most importantly, as CEOs, picked that most of them agreed with the statement of enhancing the quality of products and services, then followed by developing a more outward-looking customer-centric culture. That was the one that you picked as being the most important. Value conscious, the third one being, and I also have a little bit of trouble reading it. Yes, I can read it now better. Use agile methodologies to prototype experiences and business models to enhance speed to market. 70% picked find customers that are more value conscious, and then you can read the rest of the results on the 4 that you see at the bottom of the chart there. So varied picture. Also CEOs had a varied picture around it. Also interestingly getting sort of the fundamental things right, enhanced quality of product services, this outward-looking customer culture, and the agile methodologies to prototype experiences and business models to enhance speed to market were the ones that were picked as being most important. So let's ask our panel, and Denise, let's start with you. When you look at those 8, what are your 3 top ones? What see you happening as being more important in 2019, and other things that may be a little bit more important down the road? Is there anything that we're missing here that you think is particularly important also, Denise?
So I would have picked the omnichannel focus as my number 1. And although people can't hear the label anymore, omnichannel, because customers don't care about that. People just want to shop. They want to, satisfy their shopping wants and needs. So it doesn't matter to them what channel they use. But I think it's a highly important topic because people truly want convenience these days. They want to be able to find information on their phones or online, go to the store, maybe check something out there and then order. They also want to use new channels of communications, like voice channels, for example, or social channels. So I think this topic is actually huge, although companies have been working on it for a long time. But I think it's ever more important. And I also think, the ordering online, picking up in store will be very, very important for grocery in particular, but also probably in other categories. Number two, I would have picked customer focus, the customer-centric culture, which, that's an evergreen. That's actually the basics of marketing, to be focused on your customer and understanding their needs. I think it's more important than ever. Now that the competition is just so big, it's so important to clearly understand needs and your competitive environment. And we have some great examples of companies that are just fiercely focused on the customer, like Amazon, for example, or Nordstrom, Apple. All these companies are operating in a really tough environment and are doing really well.
But as you say, that's a bit of an evergreen, right? It's correct that people pick that as something that is very critical. But what is it that you think, particularly in 2019 or 2019 and 20, is going to be important here? What are the trends that are sort of, putting this even higher on the agenda than used to be?
I think truly understanding customers and also developing a more long-term relationship. Brand loyalty, with all these new options out there, is actually a big challenge for companies. So thinking about models and another option was there actually servitization, like to think about services around product categories. Like you're not just the pharmaceutical company anymore or the drugstore, you are the health provider. So it's just expanding into bigger categories, or you don't just buy a blouse or pants, you have a fashion stylist for you. So I think this relationship building, and that truly goes to understand the customer, being personalized and using all your digital tools that you have at your hands to be, targeting the right customers and with the right products, with the right message, and with the right pricing.
Regan, from your point of view, what are the three top ones that what the three top ones that you would choose as being really important, and where do you see the biggest impact in 2019 happening?
Yeah, for me the top two are omnichannel and being consumer centric, and I think we need to differentiate between business to business in terms of a client or business to consumer. And if we look at business to consumer, there are three big drivers of change globally that I think are going to be very influential. Increasing urbanisation, busier lifestyles, and also the spread of technology. So for me, when we look at how this evolves consumer interaction in terms of retail and brands, we need to recognise that their path to purchase is evolving really rapidly. So one insight that I often quote is that 16% of global consumers have said that at some time they have used a mobile phone to look up information about a brand or a product while they're browsing the shelf in store. And that's the way things are moving very rapidly, is that even though that sale will be registered in store, the way that they inform themselves, the way that they made a decision about that product purchase was done offline. And we need to recognise that depending on the type of product and the type of consumer, they will inform themselves and approach that path to purchase very differently. If they are looking at a consumer technology, a laptop or a phone, they will go online and have a look at blogs or social media. If they are just looking at grocery, they'll inform themselves in store potentially. So that is evolving very rapidly, and I think that decision-making process, as Denise said, is really something we need to consider more closely.
And are there particular technologies this year and the past year or so that would make you believe that, in addition to this being a long-term trend, it's going to kick in particular in 2019?
Not 2019, but over the next 2 to 3 years, I believe that the fusion of machine learning, greater access to Wi-Fi, especially in developing countries, and busier lifestyles is going to accelerate, what we see in terms of programmatic consumption or tech-driven, assumptions about products. So our technology, our devices, and machine learning, being able to learn our our behaviour, our preferences, and being able to suggest a purchase or a service before we even know that we really require it. And I believe that's within the next 2 to 3 years.
Steve, for you also, Omnichannel number one, and it was also interesting, of course, to hear from you what you think about this CEO. You haven't been a CEO yourself, and also today, reaching out to the customer much more personally and intensively. Is that something that you think is important?
First thing I would say is, in our poll, Bart, we talked to hundreds of CEOs, and yet the data that we received is entirely consistent with our respondents online today. So next year, I think we just reconvene this group and we ask these respondents, because we obviously have very, very high quality respondents today. I think, I think Denise is right. This whole consumer orientation is the biggest umbrella. Of course you have to be consumer oriented, or customer oriented, that's the whole thing. And then you've got little things like data privacy, which will pop up. It's like Y2K. Of course, they become table stakes. You've got to fix these things and respond to these things and get them online. I think the two things, though, Regan is right, is solution selling, servitization is solution selling, and omni-channel. As I think back to when I started in the grocery business 25 years ago, I was a CEO. We had a frequent shopper card. We were collecting 1 terabyte a week on our customers. We knew exactly where they lived, how many people they had in their family, how price sensitive. We had so much data, we didn't know what to do about it, and that has exploded since then. So I like to say the era of big data is dead. I don't mean it literally, but as a CEO, I had so much data I didn't know what to do with. And so I think what's going to be required in 19 is the insights. And insights means, okay, so what? What pops out of this thing that tells me where consumers are going? And this is going to be the big killer app for all service firms. And also, I think, it's our focus here at the conference board is for what's ahead. The omni-channel thing is critically important, because if you look at, everybody says, e-commerce is exploding. Yeah, but it's not happening on desktop PCs or laptop PCs. It's 100% mobile right now. That's where all the growth is. And it's what Regan said. It's people buying, actually standing in the store and buying on their phone. It's a fascinating thing. And so the successful bricks and mortar retailers are integrating it in a way that is driving people to the store to pick up. And if you think about that pair of pants that you bought, you have to go to the store, hope they have it. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do, but if they don't, they order it. You come back a week later, then you have to have it altered. You come back a week later, it's a long process. Whereas if you order it from your mobile phone, it goes there and you pick it up, or you have an alteration. It's a much shorter process. It's much more consumer friendly. It allows price shopping. So the whole omni-channel thing is, I think, going to be the theme of 2019 for successful retailers.
And what about this personal engagement of CEOs with their customers? I think this is more true probably for B2B than to B2C. That comes up as important. 68% of CEOs really agree with that view. What does that exactly mean? How does that
as a retail CEO, I was out in the stores almost every day, certainly every week. It just means that the CEOs need to experience and listen to what the consumers are saying, not filtered. And of course, any smart business person, whether you're a CEO or whether you're a marketing manager or leader, you have to be listening to the consumer, and that's all that means. It just means that you have to hear unfiltered and know what's going on. You can't just read a report. You've got to feel it, and especially in a retail environment, you have the ability to go and do that real time. So it's a great benefit. I will tell you, this is the one thing that Amazon is missing, and they talk about this, and it's one of the reasons they bought Whole Foods, is so that they have the ability to have greater interaction with their consumers. Ironically, a pure e-commerce player missing and trying to enter bricks and mortar for the benefits of bricks and mortar.
Just to add to that, though, like I completely agree with that, but also the interaction or the involvement of the CEO of digital retailers is also really beneficial. And there are many examples where the founder has been so, or the company has been so successful because the founder is extremely engaged and even listening to customers for input into products and feedback. And examples of that are, for example, Glossier, the beauty company, which started as a social blog. And so, it's truly community-based. The company listens a lot to the community, what they think. They have, these people that blog about their products. The same with companies like Warby Parker or Birchbox. There you see companies that are where they have their CEO very much involved with consumers, for learning what they want, for listening and understanding the business really very closely.
Yeah, but the flip side of that was Steve Jobs as an example, where Steve, and I knew Steve Jobs, and he said this to me. He said he didn't agree with marketing research. He thought it was a crazy waste of money. And the reason was, he said, there's no consumer that knows and can define for me what the iPhone of the future should look like. I never could have created it. So what Steve was saying, though, is that he needed to have the insight. He needed to be close enough to his consumer to have the insight of what the needs were and project where it was going so he could create and invent the device. And I think Elon Musk would tell you the same thing, as well as other true innovators. So it doesn't mean just simply go listen to the consumer and have them tell you what to do. It means truly understand the insights that are coming from your consumer.
That's
right. It goes back to indeed. Go ahead, Regan. Yeah.
Sorry, for me, I think we are in an age right now where organisations need to change more rapidly to stay successful, and I think finding those signals of change and where the direction needs to go is really important. And some of those best signals can be found by interacting with consumers.
Interesting point. Yeah. Okay, we're sort of running towards the end of the clock, but we promised that we would have a little topic at the end, which is, and actually you already started talking about it extensively when it was about the Omnichannel, but we thought we would focus a little bit more on the behavior of the digital consumer. In fact, we addressed this topic back in June last year in another window on, where we discussed projections on how digital retail would develop relative to brick and mortar, and no doubt, as is clear from the discussion, digital is not a critical game changer; it is the critical game changer for the consumer. And together with Nielsen, we developed this concept of the connected spender who engages digital to the point that was earlier made. Not necessarily meaning that I order everything for digital, but digital is a very important complementary element. But the question indeed is, what does it mean for the future of brick and mortar? Is there a sort of apocalypse where brick and mortar shops are more or less be gone, or is there still a big role for brick and mortar going forward? So we have a little poll question, and we're going to wrap up with some comments from our panel members around this. And this poll question is coming up now. It's a much simpler poll question. The question is now whether the current share of e-commerce and retail sales is about 10%. That's up from 2.25% back in 2005. What is the share of e-commerce and retail sales in the US? Let's focus on that country as one of the most advanced when it comes to retailing in 2025. Do you think it's going to be between 25 and 50%? Do you think it's going to be more than 50%? Or do you think it's going to be less than 25%? So the share of e-commerce, just for reference, today it's about 10% of overall sales goes for e-commerce in the United States. What is it going to be in 2025? Above 50%, between 25 and 50% of sales, or less than 25%. And we'll leave it open for 5 more seconds, and then we're going to close this poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And right at the end we had a few changes in the numbers, but still very clear picture emerging. Actually 2/3 of you are saying it's going to be between 25 and 50%. So in the next 12 years or so, more than a doubling, well more than a doubling from what we're seeing today. Just below a quarter of you think it's going to be less than 25%, and there are a few of you who think this is going to be such a dramatic change that by 25% it may actually be, by 2025 it may actually be more than 50%. Let's ask our panel. Steve, let's start with you this time. Where do you think this number is going to be?
Well, this is only 6 years away, and these kind of trends move very, very slowly, and so we're at about 10% today. I think in my informal polls with millennials, I ask them, what do you think the share of e-commerce is? And they tell me it's 50% or more today. So there's an impression that is out there that is much bigger than the reality of it. So I don't think that we're going to hit 25% in 6 years. It'll be somewhere between, it'll probably be 15 to 20%. It'll be high teens probably. But these things move really, really slowly over the course of time. And the fastest growing players in the e-commerce space are people like Walmart, who are doing an excellent job, and Best Buy, who are doing an excellent job of this. So it's not that I think that it's going to slow. I think it's going to continue. It's going to be huge. But the numbers in retail, it's $1 trillion business just in the U.S. So I mean, the numbers move very slowly.
Regan, what's your view? And maybe you can extrapolate a little bit also from the US to what you see in other countries in the world when it comes to e-commerce. Is it faster, for example, in China?
Yeah. So globally, I think we may be looking at less than 25% for total retail, although the forecasts do vary. Some of our Asian markets are actually the biggest and most entrenched in terms of e-commerce, especially when it comes to FMCG and grocery, where South Korea and China have been some of the earlier adopters, and there are forecasts and also estimates that over the next few years, both China and South Korea will reach about 25% of FMCG total sales online, which is really impressive. But when you look at some of the Eastern European countries that are still less than 1 or 2%, there's a lot of ground to cover for those global numbers to be relevant.
Why are some of these consumers in Asia so much more faster in adopting this than, for example, or even in the US?
Yeah, it's something that we've looked into a number of times and never really got one straight answer. I think, in terms of how it's able to change their lifestyle, they see it as a really big investment to get online, to get a smartphone. So that accessibility to a different lifestyle to help them move sometimes out of poverty is through technology adoption, and that is then moved on to things like e-commerce adoption. But it's something that I have been looking at it for many years, but still couldn't give you one straight definitive answer.
Denise, where are you on this, and what's your answer to some of those questions? Why is this moving fast?
So I would also pick the middle category, and mostly because, first of all, we have to talk about the definition of e-commerce, because about 10 years ago, we were talking about e-commerce as being purely e-commerce. That means like you would order online, you would be sent your package. These days, it's a mix. It's actually you order online, you might pick up in store, or you are at the store and order online because you picked your favorite color or fabric or something. So I think what will actually spur the growth is this mixed channel kind of buying. I also expect that cell phones will actually, although we think they are quite evolved already, but I think they will also make a leap. I think that voice will be much more strongly integrated into mobile phones. And since we almost everybody, or like, I don't know what the penetration is worldwide, but many consumers are carrying around a cell phone. So we have it with us all the time. And once the interface is easier to use especially for reorders where you know the products that you buy all the time, I think once that can be more automized, there is, that will actually lift the share for sure. And then I also think there will be more innovation yet going on. For example, like new businesses or ideas, like for example, the reselling model and peer selling. Like in the fashion world right now, there's a lot going on in terms of selling secondhand clothing to either by companies or between peers. And examples of those companies are Poshmark in the US that has been growing like phenomenally. And also, even in the luxury segment, the Real is a resale site for luxury goods, which has been doing really well. So I think these, and the peer-to-peer shopping, I also expect there to be a physical component, because shipping all the stuff around is just too expensive and also environmentally not great. Goes counter to, the current, trends that we see, which are more like for sustainability. So I just expect online to be a facilitator also, and so, but it will be a matter of definition as well. What is e-commerce? If what percentage is physical and what's digital?
Right. Well, we covered a lot of ground here. We started off with talking about confidence of consumers, which is a bit under pressure, but still doing pretty well. And then we talked about those longer-term trends, and you can't conclude anything else that consumers are really pulling the economy along. So, if you went into this, pessimistically because everything that you've been hearing on the news, then maybe you get away from this a little bit more optimistic, and that is that consumers are critical to the changes in our economy, if not the most important. And a lot covered here by our three panelists, Steve Otland, Regan Leggett, Denise Dalhoff. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a great discussion, and surely a topic to be continued at the conference board and at Nielsen. So thank you for joining us. And then finally, a few closing remarks. Of course, we'll be back next month with another window on, and perhaps not surprisingly, we're going to focus this on Brexit, and that window will be hosted by my colleague in Europe, Ilaria Maselli, our senior economist for Europe, who will update us on the latest by that time, whatever the latest is going to be, because who knows. Here are some related resources from the conference board, the Consumer Confidence Survey, which you can click here, and also our C-Suite Challenge, which we refer to during the webcast, and some other content that you can access through the conference board. With that, I'm going to close this webcast. I'm going to thank you all for joining us. Thanks for the panelists, and we hope to hear from you again one way or another through our web.